Jack Boone, the deputy sheriff, and his loyal German shepherd Shadow thought it was going to be just another stormy night in Riverbend. But when they opened the station door, they froze. Lying there in the rain was Colt McGraw, a haunted veteran who had collapsed without a sound. His eyes, when they fluttered open, carried the weight of long-forgotten wars, and in his pocket was a bundle of letters whispering of secrets darker than the storm itself. Why had this broken soldier stumbled to their doorstep? Who was hunting him through the tempest, and what truth was so dangerous someone wanted him silenced forever? What unraveled that night would expose betrayal, hidden crimes, and the fragile hope of redemption. What came next would make you weep and believe in second chances again. The town of Riverbend, Montana, lay smothered beneath a curtain of storm clouds black as coal. Wind swept down the narrow streets, rattling the loose shutters of weathered wooden homes. Rain hammered rooftops, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud winding toward swollen banks of the river. At the center of town, where Main Street widened into a small square, stood the sheriff's substation, an old stone building with peeling paint and a single lamp flickering against the downpour. Inside, Jack Boone struggled to stay awake through what had promised to be a long, uneventful night. 35 years old, tall and lean, with storm-gray eyes and hair dark as wet bark, Jack looked every bit a man forged by Montana winters. He wore a heavy patrol coat lined with wool, the kind needed to fight the bitter cold. Raised modestly, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher now long gone, he had found his calling in law enforcement. But on nights like this, silence was a luxury the storm refused to grant. By his side lay Shadow, his 5-year-old German shepherd. Once a decorated canine officer trained for raids and crowd control, Shadow had been retired after an injury. Jack couldn't let go of the partner who had saved his life more than once, so he brought him home. Shadow's coat gleamed black and tan, his eyes sharp and ever watchful. He had a way of sensing trouble before Jack even noticed. Now he lay curled on the floor, ears twitching at each thunderclap. As the storm reached its peak, Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled from him, the kind that stiffened the hair on the back of Jack's neck. Jack looked up from his desk, frowning at the flickering lamp. Shadow padded toward the door, tail stiff, and barked sharply. Jack pulled on his gloves. "Easy, boy. Let's see what you found." He unlatched the door against the driving wind, and the storm shoved its way inside. There, crumpled on the wooden steps, lay a man. Rain pooled around him, soaking a tattered military coat clinging to his gaunt frame. His boots were thick with mud hair plastered to his forehead, and a beard shadowed his weary features. Yet there was something deliberate in how he had dragged himself this far. Jack crouched beside him. The man stirred faintly, eyes clouded with exhaustion and pain. His lips moved, a ragged whisper escaping. "They're out there, watching in the dark." The man's name, as Jack would soon learn, was Colt McGraw. Colt was 42, a veteran of foreign wars. Once a decorated sergeant, the years had etched themselves deep into him. His posture bent, his eyes bloodshot. His hands shook even in restless unconsciousness. The old army coat he wore had lost its insignia. Only faded stitching remained. Ghosts of a life in uniform. Colt had come home with wounds, unseen scars that never healed. Jack eased him up, grunting at the weight. "Hang in there, buddy." Shadow whined, circling close as if urging him on. Together, man and dog hauled Colt inside. The storm raged, lightning flashing against the walls, and just as Jack laid him on the old leather bench, the lights flickered and went dead. The storm had knocked out the power. Darkness wrapped the room, broken only by the thunder outside. Jack cursed under his breath, reaching under his desk, until his fingers found a box untouched for years. Inside was an old lantern, the kind his father once carried on hunting trips. He struck a match, and the flame bloomed, bathing the office in dim amber glow. The light offered comfort, but it cast long, uneasy shadows across the walls. Colt stirred again, his face drawn in fear. The shadows. Behind me, he muttered words, tumbling half-coherent, a mind torn between nightmare and reality. Jack leaned closer. "Who's coming?" "Colt, stay with me." But Colt's eyes rolled back, his body limp once more, leaving Jack with only the echo of his warning. Shadow pressed his head against Colt's arm, whimpering, as if recognizing the torment in the man's broken spirit. A chill ran through Jack, and it wasn't from the storm outside. He studied Colt, wondering how far the man had come and what demons chased him through the rain. The lantern flickered shadows stretching across the small office, making it feel more like a lone cabin on the frontier than a place of law. Outside, the storm pounded harder, testing the walls. Jack sat back, slowly resting his hand on Shadow's head. "Looks like the night just got longer, boy." Shadow's eyes glowed in the lantern light, steady and ready. Whatever Colt McGraw had brought in from the storm, Jack Boone knew it was only the beginning. Jack Boone eased back in his chair, his palm resting on Shadow's head. "Looks like the night just got longer, boy." The dog's amber eyes glimmered under the lantern's dim glow, steady and alert. Whatever Colt McGraw had dragged in from the storm, Jack Boone understood it was only the beginning. The lantern burned low inside the sheriff's substation, its light flickering across the old stone walls while the storm battered the town outside. Jack sat at his desk, jacket still damp from hauling Colt inside. The veteran lay stretched out on the leather bench, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Shadow stayed close on the floor, his watchful eyes fixed on Colt like a sentinel. A sudden clap of thunder split the sky. Colt jerked upright with a hoarse cry, his eyes wide and unfocused. His body trembled violently, sweat mingling with rain still clinging to his coat. Jack was at his side, instantly steadying him by the shoulder. "Easy. You're safe. You're at the sheriff's office in Riverbend." Colt's gaze darted around the room, wild and confused, before slowly recognizing where he was. His fingers twitched, as if gripping a rifle that wasn't there. Then he slumped forward, clutching his head. "They don't stop," he muttered, his voice raw. "Even in my dreams, the dust, the noise, the blood, it follows me here." Jack studied him closely. He'd handled drunks, vagrants, and kids in trouble, but this was different. He'd seen soldiers return from the Middle East, friends who'd worn the same uniform, and some bore scars far deeper than bullets. Colt was one of them. "Tell me your name," Jack said firmly, his tone steady. "Colt McGraw," came the strained reply. He was 42, though he looked older. Years of combat had carved deep lines into his face. His beard was patchy, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. The old army coat hanging from his frame seemed to weigh him down more than protect him. "I served Afghanistan. Too long. Too many nights without sleep." Jack nodded slowly, leaning back on his heels. "All right, Colt. You're not alone tonight. This here's Shadow." He motioned toward the dog, who lifted his head and wagged his tail slightly before moving closer. Colt's shaking hand reached out, brushing the dog's fur. Shadow pressed against him, solid and warm, and for a heartbeat, Colt seemed anchored to the present. Thunder rolled again, and he flinched, pulling his hand back, his breathing quickening. "They've been following me," he whispered, voice catching. "Weeks now. Every town, every mile I walk, I feel them at my back. Shadows in the street, eyes in the alleys. Nobody believes me, but they're real. They want what I carry. They want me gone. Jack leaned forward, brows furrowed. Who's following you? I don't know their names, just men, tall, faceless in the dark. They don't talk, they just watch. Always close enough I can feel them. Sometimes I hear boots in the mud, sometimes whispers I can't place. And when I turn, nothing. But I know they're there. I know it. Colt's voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. Jack placed a steady hand on his shoulder. You're safe inside these walls. Whatever's outside won't touch you. Shadow's ears shot upright, a deep growl rumbling from his throat. He rose, hackles, bristling eyes fixed on the rain-smeared window. The lantern's glow cast a faint reflection against the glass, but beyond it the storm churned and shadows twisted. Jack stood quickly, his hand dropping to the grip of his holstered revolver. "What is it, boy?" Shadow barked sharply, the sound echoing off the walls. Lightning flared outside, flooding the office with stark white light. For an instant, Jack thought he saw movement, a figure slipping past the window, too fast to be sure. Colt froze, breath catching. "I told you," he whispered. "They found me." Jack moved to the window, peering out into the sheets of rain. Nothing but the storm greeted him, empty streets, water pooling in the gutter's branches bent under the gale. Yet the sense of being watched crawled up his neck. He turned back to Colt, who sat rigid on the bench, clutching his knees as if bracing for an attack. Jack knew he had to tread carefully. The man was fragile, teetering between sanity and terror, but his fear was too sharp, too specific to brush aside. Jack Boone leaned closer. "We'll figure it out. But right now you need rest. Let Shadow and me keep watch. You're safer tonight." Colt McGraw hesitated, glancing at the dog again. Shadow's eyes stayed locked on the window, his growl low but steady. Finally, Colt gave a slight nod, though his shoulders never eased. Jack set the lantern on the desk, its dim glow stretching long shadows across the floor. He pulled up a chair beside the bench, settling in for a long night. Outside, the storm roared thunder, rattling the glass, and in the spaces between, Jack could hear Colt's ragged breathing, the restless shifting of a man caught in his own memories. Minutes bled into hours. Sometimes Colt drifted into half-sleep, mumbling fragments of battles, long past names of comrades, orders barked under desert heat, pleas for help that never came. Sometimes he jolted awake with a gasp, eyes wild, until Shadow's steady presence drew him back. Each time Colt opened his eyes, he repeated the same warning in a dozen broken ways. They're watching. They're close. Jack didn't know whether to believe him, but when Shadow suddenly barked again, sharper this time, the hair rose on his arms. The storm might be hiding more than thunder and rain. It eased toward dawn, though rain still poured steadily over Riverbend. The streets gleamed like rivers of tar beneath the lamplight, every puddle reflecting the town's ghostly silence. Inside the substation, the lantern continued its faint glow, throwing long shadows across the walls. Jack leaned against the window frame, eyes scanning the street outside, listening for what Shadow seemed to sense. When the dog finally settled, Jack grabbed his raincoat and stepped out into the storm. He trusted Shadow to watch Colt inside, though the veteran had curled on the bench again, his sleep fractured by every crack of thunder. The air outside was sharp with the scent of wet earth. Jack scanned the muddy ground along the steps. It didn't take long for his gaze to fall on something unusual, a trail of footprints pressed deep into the soaked ground, heavier than his own boot prints. They weren't the staggered steps of a drunk nor the light tread of a child. These were deliberate, steady, and broad. They led away from the substation toward the side alley. Jack followed rain dripping from his hat brim. The trail ended abruptly at the corner, where shadows pooled deepest. The mud beyond was disturbed, as though whoever made the prints had stopped and waited, then vanished. Jack crouched, running his gloved fingers over the indentations. Fresh, less than an hour old. The storm would have washed away anything older. Someone had been watching. He straightened eyes, narrowing at the empty alley, but only the storm answered. Back inside, Colt sat upright, his face pale in the lantern light. He had noticed Jack's absence, and now stared at him with wide, haunted eyes. "You saw them, didn't you?" His voice cracked, laced with dread. "The shadows, the ones that follow." Jack peeled off his coat, shaking off rain. He didn't want to feed Colt's fear, but neither could he deny it. There were footprints. They ended in the alley. Whoever it was didn't stay long. Colt's hands clenched into fists. "It's them. I told you. They won't stop. They want me gone. They want what I know buried forever." He rocked forward, his voice trembling, and Shadow pressed closer, laying his head across Colt's knee. The man's shaking hand found the dog's fur again, grounding himself in the present. Jack opened his mouth to ask more when the phone on the desk rang a jarring sound against the storm's backdrop. He crossed quickly and lifted the receiver. On the other end was a woman's voice, calm, professional, but edged with urgency. "Deputy Boone. This is Lila Rose from the Riverbend clinic. I heard from one of the veterans." Jack's brow furrowed. "That's correct. Colt McGraw. He's here." There was a pause. Then the woman spoke again, softer this time. "Colt. I thought it might be him. Can you tell me, is he all right?" Jack glanced over his shoulder at the exhausted figure on the bench. Colt had turned toward the sound of the voice, though he couldn't hear the words. "He's alive, shaken, weak. He's been through more than most could bear." "I need to see him," Lila Rose replied. "I know him from before. During my volunteer work at the VA hospital in Billings, he was one of my patients. Please, Deputy, he won't trust many people, but he might trust me." Jack asked her to explain further, and she did. Lila Rose was 28, her hair the color of golden wheat pulled neatly into a ponytail. Born and raised in Riverbend, she had left for college in Helena before training as a nurse. For 2 years, she worked in military hospitals, volunteering long hours beside soldiers broken by war. She had seen Colt McGraw there, though he rarely spoke. His silence and that 1,000-yard stare had stayed with her. Last year, she returned home to Riverbend, taking a position at the clinic, though her heart still ached for the ones she could not save. "I'll come by the station right away," she said. "The storm's letting up. I can walk." Jack Boone hesitated, then agreed. If Colt truly knew her, maybe she could ease the storm raging inside him. When Jack hung up, Colt asked sharply, "Who was that Lila Rose?" Jack answered. "She's a nurse. Says she knows you from Billings." At the mention of her name, Colt's expression shifted confusion laced with recognition. He whispered her name under his breath, almost reverent, then looked away, as though ashamed. "She shouldn't see me like this. I'm not the man she once knew." Jack pulled the lantern closer, its glow steady against the darkness. "Maybe she's exactly the one you need to see. Someone who knows what you've been through. Someone who understands." Colt's lips trembled as he glanced at Shadow, who sat faithfully by his side. Outside, the storm seemed to soften, though in Colt's eyes the war was still raging. Jack leaned against the desk, soldier and dog both in his sight, and thought of the footprints in the mud. Someone had been outside close enough to listen, close enough to vanish. Jack knew the danger wasn't gone. And he knew that by morning, more questions would arrive with Lila Rose. Morning broke gray over Riverbend. The storm had clawed at rooftops through the night, But now the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. The streets were slick and empty, washed clean, yet carrying an uneasy silence. Inside the substation, the lantern still flickered on Jack's desk, though pale daylight pushed through rain-streaked windows. A knock came at the door, gentle but firm. Shadow rose instantly, tail stiff ears forward. Jack opened the door to find Lila Rose standing there. She was 28, her wheat-colored hair tied back neat. Her face was pale from the cold, cheeks flushed from the damp air, but her eyes were clear and determined. She wore a plain gray coat over her nurse's uniform, a canvas bag slung on one shoulder. Her boots were scuffed proof she had walked through the storm to get there. "Deputy Boone," she said softly. "May I come in?" Jack stepped aside. "He's inside, not doing well." Lila entered and quickly scanned the room. Her eyes landed on Colt, hunched on the bench, his army coat clinging like a second skin. He looked up at her, and recognition flickered in his weary gaze. Shame followed quickly after. Lila Colt muttered, his voice gravelly. "Didn't think you'd still be here." She set her bag down and knelt beside him, her hands gentle but practiced as she checked his pulse, his pupils, the tremor in his hands. "I told you once, Colt McGraw, you weren't a lost cause. I still believe that, but you look worse than you did in Billings." Colt flinched at the mention of the hospital. That was another life. I should have stayed gone. Maybe Lila said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. But you didn't. You're here, and that means you're meant for something more. Jack watched silently, noting how Colt's guarded posture softened under her words. Shadow edged closer, resting his head on Colt's boot as if to remind him he wasn't alone. As Lila adjusted Colt's coat to listen to his breathing, something slipped from the inside pocket and hit the floor with a faint thud, a bundle of letters yellowed and tied with a fraying string. Lila picked them up, frowning. "Colt, what are these?" His face went pale. Don't open them." But she had already seen the return addresses, Army divisions, military bases across the country. Her brow furrowed as she noticed names, dates, signatures. She carefully untied the string and unfolded one page. The handwriting was sharp, official, chilling. Jack stepped closer. "What do they say?" Lila read aloud in a low voice. "The shipment will arrive under cover of night. Report filed under classified channels, no oversight required." She scanned further. "Maintain silence. Unit Bravo Centene remains outside civilian jurisdiction." Colt's hands shook as he reached for the papers, but Jack caught his wrist gently. "Colt, this is evidence." "Why are you carrying these?" With a defeated sigh, Colt leaned back against the wall. "My father, Major Jed McGraw." Colt said, his voice hoarse. He was part of a unit meant to guard supply lines overseas, but he discovered shipments weren't going where they were supposed to. American weapons sold off the books. He swallowed hard. He kept records, letters, proof. He told me once it was bigger than any single man could stop. Jack Boone's jaw tightened. "And your father—" "He died," Colt whispered. "Officially a training accident. But I knew better. He left me these letters before it happened. Said if anything ever happened to him, I'd know why." The room went silent, except for the steady patter of rain on the roof. Lila Rose folded the letters carefully, her face pale. "This is dangerous, Colt. These aren't just memories. They're evidence." Shadow suddenly padded over to Colt's battered backpack beside the bench, pawing, until something slipped free, a crumpled sheet of paper. He carried it to Jack, who unfolded it. Jack's stomach sank. It was a list of names scrawled in ink, some crossed out, others underlined. military officers, contractors. And at the bottom, one name made Jack's chest tighten: Silas Kane. Jack knew him well. 55, wealthy owner of the largest lumber operation in Riverbend, always dressed in pressed suits, silver hair slicked back, celebrated for his donations to schools and churches. But Jack had heard the whispers. Contracts that seemed rigged, workers who vanished after accidents at the mills. Kane. Jack muttered. What the hell is his name doing here? Colt's face darkened. Because he's not just a businessman, he's part of it. My father uncovered that Kane was laundering money for those shipments. That's why I've been running. Every town I pass through, someone's on my trail. They work for him. Lila pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Silas Kane sits on the town council. He funds half the community projects. If he's involved, no one's safe. Jack's tone was grim. Then you're right. They won't stop until this is buried. But now we've got names, and names mean leverage. Leverage won't matter if they kill us first. Colt rasped, his voice trembling. Lila set a steady hand on his arm. Then we make sure they don't. You've carried this burden alone too long, Colt. Maybe it's time you trusted someone else. The rain outside quickened, rattling against the glass. Jack knew the storm hadn't passed. It had only shifted. And within Riverbend, where respect and corruption often shared the same table, the truth bound up in those letters was about to set something in motion none of them could control. By morning, Riverbend wore a mask of quiet respectability. The streets gleamed with rainwater, and townsfolk went about their lives as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet for Jack Boone, everything felt changed. The old letters and the list from Colt's bag had cast shadows over names once thought untouchable. And one name glared brightest: Silas Kane. Jack had known of him for years. 55, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair neatly combed back, and expensive suits that stood out among the working clothes of mill hands. Kane had inherited his family's lumber business and grown it until it spanned 3 valleys, supplying timber across the state. In public, he was the benefactor donating for the church, Roof sponsoring scholarships, attending council meetings with the ease of a man born to power. But whispers clung to him. Workers spoke of harsh contracts of injuries, hushed up of wages that vanished after deductions. Jack had never caught him in anything illegal, but now with Kane's name on Colt's list, every rumor carried weight. Inside the substation, Colt sat slumped on the bench, clutching the tin mug of coffee Lila Rose had placed in his hands. He still looked fragile, a man hunted both by enemies in the dark and ghosts in his mind. His coat was pulled tight around his shoulders, but Colt McGraw's eyes were clear for the moment. When Jack Boone spoke Silas Kane's name, Colt's expression hardened like stone. That's him, Colt said firmly. He's the one who sent men after me. My father traced payment shell companies, all of it pointed back to Kane. Every time I moved to a new town, it was his men who showed up. Jack crossed his arms, uneasy. Accusing Silas Kane isn't simple. He's got influence. Half this town sees him as its backbone. We'll need more than whispers and old letters. Colt's jaw tightened. Those letters are enough to make them want me dead. That tells you all you need to know. Before Jack could answer, Shadow barked sharply at the door. The shepherd bolted outside, ignoring the drizzle still falling. Jack and Lila Rose followed in a rush. They found Shadow at the drainage ditch along the side of the substation. A boy no more than 8 had slipped on the wet grass and tumbled into the shallow but fast-moving runoff. The current tugged at him, pulling him toward a clogged culvert. It was Billy Knox, a neighbor's kid. Small, dark hair plastered to his forehead, a red flannel shirt clinging to him far too thin for the cold morning. His family lived 2 streets over, struggling ever since his father lost his job at the mill. Shadow leapt into the ditch without hesitation, bracing against the current. He clamped his teeth gently onto Billy's sleeve and pulled with steady strength until the boy was dragged safely onto the bank. Jack scrambled down, hauling Billy fully out, holding him close as the boy coughed and clung to his arm. Lila wrapped her coat around him, rubbing his back. "You're safe now, sweetheart. Just breathe." Billy looked up at Shadow, wide-eyed. "He saved me," he whispered, still trembling. Jack ruffled the boy's wet hair and managed a faint smile. "Yeah, he did. Shadow always knows when someone's in trouble." They walked Billy home, his small hand gripping Jack's, while Shadow trotted beside them, tail wagging. Edna Knox, the boy's weary mother, with flour still dusting her apron, wept as she hugged her son and thanked Jack and the dog over and over. Back at the substation, Colt watched Shadow with something close to awe. That dog, he's more than muscle. He feels things. He knew the boy was in danger before any of us. Jack nodded. He saved me more times than I can count. Shadow doesn't hesitate. That's why I trust him. The quiet didn't last long. A black car rolled slowly past the substation, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky, giving no glimpse inside. Jack noticed Colt stiffen his hand, tightening around the mug. "That's them," Colt muttered. "Kane's men. They circle like wolves." Jack's eyes tracked the car until it disappeared down the street. He couldn't be certain, but the slow crawl, the silence of its passing, stirred the same unease that had haunted him the night before. "Then we'll find out," Jack said grimly. "If Kane's got his hand in this Riverbend, isn't as safe as it looks. But I won't let shadows run this town." Shadow settled by the bench again, resting his head on his paws, but his eyes never left the window. The drizzle outside softened, but inside the substation, the storm was only just beginning. Night draped heavy over Riverbend, darker than usual, as if the town itself sensed something brewing beneath its quiet streets. The rain had thinned to a mist, and the main street lay hushed lamps casting pale halos of light into the fog. Inside the substation, the air was just as tense. The discovery of Kane's name and the black car's slow patrol the day before had Jack on edge. Shadow was restless too, his ears twitching at every sound. Colt sat near the desk, wrapped in his tattered coat, his eyes hollow, yet sleepless. Lila Rose, who had begun visiting daily under the guise of health checks, was there again, quietly setting a pot of tea on the small stove in the corner. She had slipped into the rhythm of the place with ease, her calm presence bridging the distance between lawman veteran and dog. The fragile peace shattered with a crash. Glass exploded inward as a rock hurtled through the front window shards, scattering across the wooden floor. Shadow lunged to his feet. Barking furiously, muscles coiled tight. Jack grabbed his revolver and rushed to the broken window. The street outside lay empty, just drizzle and fog. On the floor was the rock wrapped in a piece of paper. Jack unfolded it under the lantern light. The words were scrawled in thick, angry strokes. "Send him out if you want to live." Colt McGraw staggered forward, staring at the note with wide, haunted eyes. His face collapsed into despair as he dropped into a chair, burying his hands against his face. "It's me. It's always me. They'll kill anyone who stands beside me. I should go. I should end this before more blood gets spilled." Jack Boone crouched in front of him, voice steady, but not unkind. "You're not running, Colt. That's exactly what they want. You've been hunted long enough. It ends here with us." Colt shook his head violently. "You don't understand. They don't stop. They never stop. I can't drag you down with me." Just then Shadow moved forward, planting himself squarely in front of Colt. The shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding. Then again louder eyes locked on the broken veteran. It was as though the dog himself refused to let Colt move an inch. Colt stared at Shadow, his breath uneven. For the first time in days, something other than terror flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe even gratitude. Jack set a firm hand on Colt's shoulder. "See, even he knows you're meant to fight this, not run from it. As long as you're under this roof, you're not alone. I give you my word." Lila Rose stepped closer with a steaming cup of tea. She spoke softly, but her voice carried a steel edge. "You've carried your father's burden too long, Colt. You don't have to anymore. Let us help." Her words weren't just comfort, they carried memory. Colt looked up at her, his eyes clouded by the past. Years ago in Billings, she had been the one who coaxed him to eat when he refused food, the one who sat with him through the nights when flashbacks tore him apart. And now here she was again, refusing to let him drown. Jack saw it clearly. Lila wasn't just a nurse to Colt. She was a lifeline to his humanity. And to Jack himself, she was becoming something else entirely. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding sparking between them. In the midst of threats and shadows, something fragile but undeniably real was taking root. The hours dragged on, every creak of the old substation, pulling low growls from Shadow. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the world. Colt tried to rest, but every time his head dipped, he startled awake, breath ragged. Jack stayed vigilant by the window, his revolver resting on the desk within reach. Lila busied herself with notes, scribbling down Colt's symptoms, but her gaze drifted toward him more often than not, determination burning in her eyes. Past midnight, Jack caught sight of a silhouette at the edge of the street. Tall, broad, pausing just long enough to make sure he was seen. By the time Jack reached the door, the figure had melted back into the fog. He locked it tight. "They're testing us," he muttered, "trying to scare us into giving him up." Colt's voice quivered. "It's working." Jack spun toward him. "No, not on my watch. I've dealt with threats before. They'll need more than rocks and scribbled notes to break us. If Kane's men want to fight, they'll learn Riverbend doesn't bow so easy." Lila put a hand on Jack's arm, steady and firm. "Remember, they're not just testing you. They're testing him. Every time they strike Colt, relives the war. We need to keep him standing just as much as we need to keep him safe." Jack's gaze shifted to Colt, who sat slumped but alive, gripping the cup of tea like it was the only thing keeping him here. Jack gave a slow nod. "Then we'll stand together." Shadow curled by the shattered window, his body coiled, tight eyes still fixed outside. In that dim-lit room among broken glass and whispered vows, 3 souls and 1 loyal dog braced themselves for whatever storm was coming next. Riverbend carried a false calm as night fell again. Fog curled thick across the streets, swallowing lamplight, erasing the outlines of familiar buildings. Jack's restlessness grew heavier. After the rock and the threatening note, he couldn't keep Colt locked inside forever. So when Colt asked for a walk to clear his head, Jack agreed. Partly because the veteran needed the air, partly because Jack wanted to see the town's edges for himself. Shadow padded close at their side paws, pressing dark prints into the damp earth as they followed the dirt path leading out of town toward the trees, where Riverbend's streets surrendered to the woods. The forest pressed in around them, dripping branches still heavy with rain. Colt McGraw tugged his coat tighter, his eyes darting into the gloom as if ghosts lurked between the trees. Jack Boone glanced sideways. "You good to keep going?" Colt gave a stiff nod. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched, but determination burned beneath the weariness. I need to prove I can still stand on my own 2 feet, not just hide behind walls. They pressed deeper until the hush of town gave way to the creak of branches and the distant rush of water. That was when Shadow froze. His ears pricked, muscles taut, every line of his body coiled for trouble. Jack halted, instincts sparking alive. From the trees, 2 figures stepped out, both in dark clothing, faces hidden behind cloth pulled to their eyes. They moved with confidence, the kind honed by practiced violence. One hefted an iron rod, the other flicked a knife that gleamed under thin moonlight. Jack drew his revolver, voice sharp. "Stay back!" But the men surged forward. The rod swung hard toward Jack's skull. In a blur of fur and muscle, Shadow launched, teeth clamping down on the attacker's arm, dragging the swing off course. The rod slammed into the ground, inches from Jack's leg. Jack stumbled back, firing a shot skyward, the crack rolling like thunder. The second man lunged at Colt, blade raised. Colt froze, breath short, and ragged memories exploding across his mind. For an instant he was back in Afghanistan, mortars screaming, men dying all around him. His hands shook as he fumbled for the pistol Jack had given him. But once his fingers closed on the grip, instinct snapped awake. He fired upward, the bullet tearing through branches overhead. The gun's roar echoed through the forest, louder than the storm itself. The masked men staggered back, startled by his defiance. Shadow bit down harder, forcing the rod to clatter into the mud. Jack seized the opening, shoving the man against a tree, revolver aimed at his chest. "Let's go!" The knife-wielder barked, his voice muffled, but young, no more than 30. He yanked his partner's shoulder, dragging him free. The two melted into the trees, swallowed by darkness. Shadow chased a few steps before Jack's sharp command pulled him back. Colt lowered the pistol, his hands trembling violently. His eyes were wide, but for the first time there was something other than fear. There was resolve. "I stood my ground," he muttered, almost to himself. Jack clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did more than that. You pushed them back." Something glinted in the mud. Jack bent and picked up a black smartphone. Its screen cracked, but still working. A string of messages filled the display. The last one read, "Keep him moving. Kane wants this done by week's end." Jack's jaw tightened. There was no doubt anymore. Silas Kane wasn't just a name on Colt's list, he was pulling the strings. Colt slumped onto a fallen log, burying his face in his hands. "You see now, it's him. It's always been him." Jack slipped the phone into his pocket, eyes scanning the woods. "Then we've got more than shadows. We've got proof. And proof is something we can fight with." Shadow pressed close at Colt's feet, grounding the veteran with his steady weight. Colt looked down, scratching the dog's head with a shaky laugh. "You saved him," he murmured. "And you saved me, too." Jack stood tall, revolver still in hand, his storm-gray eyes cutting into the dark. Riverbend no longer felt like a quiet town. It felt like a battlefield, and Silas Kane had just declared war. Back at the substation, the air was heavy as soaked earth. Jack sat at his desk, the cracked phone glowing faintly beside the old lantern. Colt hunched in a corner chair, his coat still clinging hands, twisting in nervous knots. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes flicking between the two men, ever watchful. Near the stove, Lila Rose stood, with her hair tied back, steam rising from the pot she stirred. She had become part of the station itself, her calm presence steadying them in the middle of the storm closing in. Jack finally broke the silence. "You've carried these letters for years, Colt. You've been hunted across town, sleeping on benches and alleys, all because of what your father uncovered. If we're gonna make it through whatever Kane's planning," Jack Boone said, his voice steady as thunder, I need the whole truth. No more fog. Lay it all out. Colt McGraw, stiffened shoulders rising like a man walking back into a war zone. His eyes flicked toward the rain-slicked window before he finally spoke. Voice, scraping low and hoarse. My father, Major Jed McGraw. He wasn't just some army man. He believed in rules, structure, doing things by the book. He ran logistics overseas. But stuff started disappearing, ammo crates, weapons. Reports didn't match up. He followed the paper trail straight into hell. Jack leaned forward, jaw clenched. Let me guess, Silas Kane. Colt nodded grimly. He was the middleman. My dad tracked him right back here to Riverbend, hiding behind that fancy timber company. But the crates, they weren't hauling wood, they were filled with rifles, explosives. Dad had the evidence. He was going to go public. His hands shook, his voice fraying. Then one night, driving home from Helena, his Jeep accidentally veers off the road. They called it training mishap, but he wasn't even on duty. He never touched a drop. He was silenced. The room went still, the weight of those words lingering like lightning before it strikes. Lila Rose had gone quiet by the stove spoon in hand, but now she crossed the room slowly. She knelt beside Colt, her eyes soft with conviction. When you were in Billings, you mumbled bits of this in your sleep. Nobody listened. They brushed it off as trauma. Jack's chest burned. He'd suspected shady dealings, but this ran deeper. If Kane's got friends in Helena, maybe even higher, he's not just powerful, he's protected. Colt looked haunted. Dad wanted me to finish what he couldn't, but I ran. And they've been chasing me ever since. Every time I stopped run, Lila's eyes hardened. Then maybe it's time we stop letting them write your story for you. She pulled a beat-up folder from her bag. Jack raised a brow. These are VA medical records, she explained, spreading pages across the desk. From when I volunteered. I made copies not by the book, I know, but something told me they mattered. Typed sheets covered the table, military stamps, clear as day. She pointed to one page. His last physical. No signs of alcohol, nothing that would have caused him to crash. And here she flipped to another finger, tapping the margin he reported being followed. Noted paranoia. But look here, he names Silas Kane. Mentioned strange fund transfers linked to shipments. Colt stared at the papers like they were ghosts from a past he couldn't bury. His voice broke. You kept these. All this time because I believed you, Lila whispered. I believed your dad didn't die by accident, and now with those letters his suspicion becomes fact. Jack gathered the records, laying them beside the cracked phone and the bundle of old correspondence. This ain't just a Riverbend issue anymore. Kane's network stretches wide. State officials, maybe federal. But if we connect these dots, prove this stuff's real, we can rip that shield right off him. Colt's breath steadied. His eyes still shimmered, but now with fire. He died for this. And if we do nothing, I fail him again. Jack slammed his palm to the desk. Then we don't do nothing. He looked around at them both. We fight. With those letters. These records. That phone. We don't just protect you, Colt, we take the whole damn wall down. Shadow curled at Colt's boots, lifted his head, and gave a low, solemn bark like he understood. Colt gave the dog a shaky smile, his voice barely a whisper. It's bigger than us. They won't quit. But maybe now we've got a shot. Lila placed her hand gently over his. Your father stood for justice, she said softly. And tonight, justice speaks back. Outside the rain hit harder, drumming against the windows. But inside that worn substation, a new storm was forming, one born of truth, and the danger of finally shining a light where powerful men had always kept the dark. The substation had turned into a last-stand bunker. Rain slammed the roof like a war drum, and the wooden walls groaned under the weight of the storm, but inside, something stronger stirred purpose. Jack Boone laid out the files, military reports, faded letters, a cracked smartphone, all the pieces that connected Silas Kane to a sprawling conspiracy, stretching far beyond Riverbend. Lila Rose stood at his side, sorting the papers into battered folders. Shadow paced the room tense and alert, his ears twitching at every thunderclap. Colt McGraw sat nearby, no longer the ragged fugitive they'd pulled from the downpour. His posture was firm, eyes alive with a fire Jack hadn't seen before, no longer afraid but resolved. "We get this into federal hands," Colt said, voice low and steady, "and Kane's empire falls apart." Jack gave a tight nod. "I've already made the call. State police are teaming up with the feds. They'll be here by dawn. We just have to hold until then." But dawn was still hours away. The warning came in a growl from Shadow. He went stiff tail, straight ears locked toward the window. Headlights pierced the downpour, slow-moving, too deliberate to be casual traffic. Jack snuffed out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness, his revolver drawn in a blink. Gravel crunched. Voices, muffled, urgent, closed in. Then the front door thundered under a heavy blow. "Positions," Jack ordered. Lila crouched behind the desk, white-knuckling a flashlight like a club. Colt rose, gripping the pistol Jack had given him, his hand shaky but determined. Shadow planted himself at the doorway, lips curled, muscles coiled. The door burst open. Silas Kane stepped through. First towering, drenched in his tailored overcoat, silver hair slicked by the rain. Even at 55, he moved with the arrogance of a man convinced that wealth could erase consequences. 4 thugs followed big men in soaked work jackets, fists wrapped around bats and knives. One had a shotgun, a scar slashed across his cheek. Rufus Lane. Kane's voice oozed menace. "Deputy Boone, you've made a mistake siding against me. Hand over McGraw and maybe the others walk out of here." Jack raised his gun. "This is your last chance, Kane. Leave now while you can still walk." Rufus sneered. "Or what, you're outgunned." The fight exploded. One goon lunged at Lila with a crowbar. Shadow launched, sinking his teeth into the attacker's forearm with a wet crunch. The man screamed as metal clanged to the floor. Lila scrambled back, face pale but defiant. Another rushed Jack, blade in hand. Jack fired the shot, splintering the wall an inch from the man's head. "Try that again," Jack growled, "and the next one won't miss." Kane turned to Colt, voice dripping contempt. "You should have stayed in the gutter, boy. Now you've dragged decent people down with you." For a moment, Colt staggered under the storm's roar and chaos, flashing back to desert firefights and smoke. But then he saw Shadow defending Lila, saw Jack standing unshaken, and he remembered his father's voice, firm and proud. Colt squared his shoulders. His hand stopped trembling. No more running. He fired a shot into the ceiling. The crack thundered like judgment. Dust rained from the rafters. Kane and his thugs froze. Colt stepped forward, eyes burning. "Drop your weapons. Now, or the next bullet won't be a warning." Rufus cursed, but Jack aimed his revolver at him, steady as stone. Shadow dragged the injured thug to the floor with a snarl. The room held its breath. Then sirens. Red and blue lights shattered the darkness outside. Tires screeched. Dozens of officers poured in, floodlights, blazing weapons drawn. "Police! Drop your weapons," a voice barked. Kane's face drained. The swagger vanished. For the first time, he looked like what he truly was, cornered. One by one, his men dropped their weapons. Shadow released his grip, but stayed poised, growling low. Officers swept in, cuffing the goons with practiced ease. Another deputy approached Kane, reading his rights. He tried to protest, tried to bark orders, but no one listened. The king of Riverbend had fallen. Colt slowly lowered his pistol breath, coming hard. The crushing weight of 10 years finally began to ease, not gone, but lifting. He looked at Jack and managed a tired, grateful smile. We did it. My father, he can finally rest. Jack holstered his revolver and placed a firm hand on Colt's shoulder. No, Colt. You did it. You stood your ground and faced him down. Lila Rose stepped in, brushing shattered glass from her coat, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears. You didn't just survive tonight. You fought back. Outside, the storm had softened into a gentle drizzle. Riverbend was quiet again, but this time it was the calm of justice fulfilled. The trial of Silas Kane rocked Riverbend to its foundation. For decades, his name had carried weight, spoken in hushed tones, cloaked in admiration. But in the Helena courthouse, stripped of expensive suits and smug confidence, he looked like any other man finally facing his sins. Witness after witness came forward. The evidence towered high. And when Colt McGraw took the stand, his voice steady, his eyes clear, the room held its breath. For the first time since Major Jed McGraw's death, Colt's truth wasn't dismissed as delusion. It was fact. The jury didn't need long. Guilty on all charges, illegal arms trading conspiracy, and manslaughter tied to the murder of Jed McGraw. Silas Kane's sentencing sent shockwaves across the state. Officials once loyal to him were dragged into the light, forced to answer for their silence. What began in darkness now stood exposed in the noonday sun. Back in Riverbend, the town had changed. People whispered about that long night at the substation, how Deputy Jack Boone, his fearless canine shadow, the battle-worn vet Colt, and the steady-hearted nurse Lila Rose had faced down evil and stood tall. Shadow became a local legend. Children would stop in the street just to pet him. Folks left biscuits at the substation as offerings of thanks. To Riverbend, he wasn't just a dog. He was the protector that saved them all. But it was Colt McGraw whose life shifted the most. No longer hunted, no longer the town's ghost. With the conviction he was honored, a man who had carried truth and lived to see justice done. The praise made him uneasy at first. Applause felt foreign after years spent in shadows. But Lila's gentle patience and Jack's quiet strength helped him find his footing again. Together they'd walk to the Veterans Center, a small red brick building at the town's edge. Its director, Amos Holloway, a Vietnam vet with a limp and a warm presence, didn't need many words. He knew that weight Colt carried. "You've walked through fire and came back with a story to tell," Amos said, offering him a position running outreach for struggling vets. "That means something. That's hope, son." For Colt, it wasn't just a job, it was a second chance. Every day he sat with younger vets, listened to the echoes of their nightmares, and offered what he once needed, most proof that healing was real. Meanwhile, Jack and Lila found themselves drawn together, not just by the fire they'd survived, but by the calm after. Dinner turned to long porch talks. Talks gave way to laughter, the kind of laughter that softened sharp edges. Jack's quiet steadiness became the rock Lila had always searched for. And in turn, her warmth cracked through the walls he'd built years ago. The town honored them all. A mural was painted across the library's wall, shadow mid-leap fierce and protective. Underneath, courage has many forms. The morning after the sentencing, sunlight broke across Riverbend for the first time in days. Golden rays lit up the rain-slicked streets, rooftops gleamed, and the scent of wet pine filled the air. On the substation porch, Jack stood with a steaming mug of coffee. Lila leaned on the railing beside him, her blonde hair kissed by morning light. Colt joined them taller now, not in height, but in presence. Dignity returned to his shoulders. Shadow lay at their feet, tail thumping lightly, eyes watchful but calm. They didn't need words. The silence was no longer heavy with sorrow, but light with hope. "Feels different," Colt said softly. Jack nodded. "Because it is. The past doesn't own you anymore." Lila reached for Jack's hand. This time she didn't pull away. Colt noticed the gesture and smiled faintly, quietly. And so, under a rising sun and clear skies, 3 souls and 1 loyal German shepherd stood side by side, tied not by trauma, but by triumph. The ghosts of the past had lost their grip. Ahead, only healing, community, and the promise of peace. The storm had passed. A new dawn had come. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with guns or fists, but inside the human soul. Colt McGraw's journey reminds us that even in the darkest night, faith can bring light, and from brokenness, strength can rise again. If you've ever faced a silent battle, or know someone who has shared this story, leave a comment below and tell us what part gave you hope. Subscribe for more stories of redemption, courage, and quiet miracles. And if you still believe in second chances, type Amen in the comments and let your faith light the way for someone else.